On April 6, 2026, Earth slipped behind the moon. 4 people were 252,756 miles from home, farther than any humans in history. Inside Orion, all 4 watched Earth sink below the lunar horizon. 3 minutes later, the moon blocked their radio link. The silence was planned. Gravity bent their free return path home. Orion passed 4,067 miles above the far side. The first crewed Orion kept working through the blackout. Harry considers 252,756 miles a personally insult to the measuring tape. Yet the record was only the headline. The deeper question concerned a complete crewed system. Could 4 people travel that far on Orion's first crewed flight? Could they trust the complete system to bring them safely home? No humans had left Earth orbit for the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972. 54 years can turn a heroic machine into a museum piece. Apollo's controllers retired. Its young viewers became grandparents. Gravity remained. The living chain of vehicles, teams, and practice decisions did not. Apollo 13 held the distance record after its 1970 emergency return. Artemis II would use a free return path deliberately. Lunar gravity would bend Orion back without entering lunar orbit. Free return reduced one class of risk. Artemis I had flown Orion without people. Artemis II had to answer questions only humans create inside a system. 4 would breathe, sleep, sweat, and improvise inside Orion. Could the cabin keep air and support ordinary life? Could a crew fly the vehicle by hand? Could navigation stay trustworthy in deep space? Could mission control hear, guide, and know when to wait? Later missions would demand more from every system. Later missions would attempt orbit and landing. Artemis II's job was testing the crewed transportation system. The vehicle was one link in a complete human system. Artemis II would test it where help could not arrive quickly. The test began when 4 climbed aboard. Reid Wiseman commanded. Victor Glover piloted. Christina Koch served as mission specialist. Jeremy Hansen flew as a Canadian Space Agency mission specialist. They divided the work by role, not by importance. Every object could float, every checklist mattered, and loose gear developed ambition. The answer was rehearsal, cross-checks, and years of learning one another. They practiced geology in Iceland's volcanic terrain. They navigated, collected samples, and described what they saw. They rehearsed emergencies and learned the displays. They practiced living and exercising in tight quarters. Their custom orange survival suits were built for launch and return. Training made the suit familiar before it had to become shelter. By repetition, an unfamiliar capsule became a workplace. The rocket beneath them was the Space Launch System, with Orion at the top. Then, a helium flow problem appeared in the upper stage. Helium helped condition the stage and pressurize its propellant tanks. The stack rolled back roughly 4 miles to the vehicle assembly building. Technicians installed platforms and traced the interruption. They replaced the helium quick disconnect seal, installed fresh batteries, and repeated functional checks. A moon rocket had moved the wrong way, so the next direction could be safe. By April 1st, SLS and Orion were back at pad 39B. The crew suited up and traveled to the pad together. They boarded Orion and settled into the cabin. The hatch was sealed and pressure integrity checked. Suits and communications were checked one last time. Above them waited a machine capable of about 8.8 million pounds of force. Harry's umbrella was not rated for exhaust. At 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time on April 1st, the boosters lit. Artemis II rose from pad 39B. The crew had acceleration, vibration, instruments, and procedures, not a lunar panorama. The solid boosters separated. The core stage finished its work. The core stage separated, leaving the upper stage to continue. Orion's 4 solar array wings unfolded to power the spacecraft. Power flowed to life support, avionics, and communications. Reaching space did not earn an immediate trip to the moon. Crew and ground teams inspected the machine in high Earth orbit. The separated upper stage became a practice target. Onboard navigation sensors measured the relative position. The crew took manual control for the close-range demonstration. Small reaction control thrusters moved Orion around the target. Orion approached the upper stage under manual control. It held position so engineers could compare response with predictions. Then the crew backed away in a controlled retreat. Approach and retreat continued for roughly 70 minutes. Harry's parking advice remained mercifully unheard. Engineers watched exactly how the vehicle responded. An automated departure burn ended the proximity demonstration safely. Back inside, the full spacecraft examination continued with 4 people in the evidence. Flight systems were stable, powered, and still being checked. Cabin circulation and life support readings joined the review. A troublesome toilet indicator reminded everyone that exploration also contains plumbing. Crew and ground teams assessed the data without turning a nuisance into a crisis. A burn raised the orbit's low point. Before the commitment burn, the team could still withhold departure. On April 2nd, mission managers reviewed Orion's health. The room polled, go for the burn that mattered most. The service module engine fired for 5 minutes and 50 seconds. Translunar injection raised Orion out of Earth orbit. This was the moment the crew truly committed. There was no quick turn around the block. Harry's car key vanished as disciplined routine replaced spectacle. Koch checked cabin air and water from the same console. They watched power, temperature, propulsion, and navigation. Glover exercised on a compact flywheel device while restrained. Hansen and Koch practiced medical responses with a training dummy far from a hospital. Koch tested an emergency radio through the deep space network to Earth. A laser communication system sent high-definition data toward Earth. The ground received the stream and relayed it to Houston. Koch and Hansen took turns flying Orion manually. They tested multiple thruster modes and motion axes. The 41-minute test gave engineers 2 human perspectives. The spacecraft translated, rotated, and held attitude on command. Ground teams could compare human handling with their models. Then the vehicle returned to steady automatic flight. Harry's model achieved 6 degrees of freedom and 7 degrees of confusion. All 4 astronauts pressurized their survival suits. They checked for leaks and practiced getting into their seats. They tested movement, eating, and drinking while sealed inside. A later correction refined the path toward the moon. 2 earlier corrections were unnecessary because Orion was already flying precisely. Trust grew through meals, sleep, sweat, radio checks, and small surprises, not spectacle. On April 6th, Orion entered the moon's realm. The crew prepared the windows, cameras, and cabin for observation. The moon grew from a disk into terrain. Craters, ridges, ancient plains, and long shadows came into view. The astronauts began the long observation period. Their descriptions reached scientists in Houston. Then the distance itself became history. Orion passed Apollo 13's 248,655-mile mark. At 6:41 p.m. Eastern Time, Earth sank behind the lunar horizon. The blue world slipped behind grey terrain. Earthset completed at 6:41 p.m. 3 minutes later, the moon blocked a direct radio path to Earth. Mission Control could predict the silence, but no controller could speak through a world. The crew kept photographing and describing the far side without a live voice from Houston. At 7 p.m., Orion passed about 4,067 miles above the lunar surface. Lunar gravity bent Orion onto the inbound leg of its free return path. At 7:02 p.m., the crew reached 252,756 miles from Earth. That was 4,111 miles beyond Apollo 13. Life support, power, guidance, and navigation continued through the blackout. At 7:24 p.m., Orion approached the opposite lunar limb. Earth rose over the opposite limb. The Deep Space Network reacquired Orion. Mission Control heard the crew again. Human eyes picked out color differences that could help scientists interpret composition and surface age. Later, a nearly hour-long solar eclipse began. The dark moon moved before the sun. The corona became visible around the lunar edge. Observation and spacecraft work continued through the eclipse. The record mattered, but distance alone was not the test. The test was maintaining people, power, observation, navigation, and confidence. Orion left the moon's farthest and quietest interval on the return arc. After the flyby, the free return arc was already carrying Orion home. Earth grew from a blue point into a planet again. The crew repeated checks while Earth drew ahead. The crew repeated checks and secured the cabin for return. Recovery boats, helicopters, and ship crews moved into position in the Pacific. On April 10th, the crew sealed orange survival suits and strapped in for the last hard test. At 7:33 p.m., the crew and service modules separated, exposing the broad heat shield. 4 minutes later, a raised burn aligned the exposed heat shield for entry. The first thin air became a sheath of heat around the descent. A controlled plasma envelope wrapped the capsule as speed poured away. Inside, the suited crew rode the heavy deceleration. Radio faded during the hottest phase. The heat shield took the punishment while the protected cabin stayed safe. The spacecraft emerged intact and much slower. High above the Pacific, Orion prepared its parachute bay for recovery. At about 23,400 feet, 2 drogue parachutes deployed above Orion. They slowed and stabilized the descending capsule. At about 5,400 feet, the drogues released. 3 main parachutes emerged above Orion, compact and partly inflated. The mains blossomed and lowered the capsule toward the sea. The Pacific filled the view below, with the recovery ship waiting on the horizon. Orion splashed down upright off San Diego at 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time. The broad splash collapsed as Orion floated and recovery boats closed in. Recovery swimmers secured a flotation collar around Orion. A small raft formed a working porch beside Orion's hatch. The hatch opened, and recovery staff helped the astronauts out, one by one, onto the raft. An unmarked helicopter carried each astronaut to the recovery ship. Orion followed by cable into a fitted shipboard cradle. After medical handoff, 4 people who had traveled farther from Earth than anyone sat together, safely home. The useful result was larger than a trophy measured in miles. Artemis II tested crew, spacecraft, rocket, control rooms, networks, and recovery as one rehearsal. It exposed problems, tested responses, and returned evidence for missions that would ask more. The road to the moon did not reopen with a footprint. It reopened when a complete human system went out, worked, and came home.